It is February 23, 2016, and we are in the second day of Purim, just entering into it actually. So let's pray before we get into our subject. Heavenly Family, Todah, thank you. Thank you so much once again for bringing us together to consider some important points of our past history and to be able to learn the lessons and to learn how to investigate these things and to actually practice thinking your thoughts and your ways and according to your principles. So guide us in all this. And Sister, please bring this about to be the best meeting that it possibly can be. And guide us to work in cooperation with you. Send your angels to each person here and bring everyone into an awareness of the atmosphere of heaven, relieving the burdens of this worldly life and also relieving the temptations of the enemy. So guide us, Heavenly Family. Thank you so much. Father, Mother, we ask these things, B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of Branch.
Amen.
Okay, so what we ended up going through last night, and I'll kind of recap just for the sake of bringing all of our minds back to the subject, and also for those who weren't on last night to know where we are at and what we are doing. So, of course, Purim is the memorial or the celebration of the victory and the deliverance of the Jews in the days of Esther and Mordecai, which took place most likely, I'll just repeat that, which took place most likely in the days of Artexerxes Longimanus, as he is most commonly known. This would be in the, I suppose it would be in the 5th century BCE. So in past years, we have read the book of Esther, the version of it represented in the Masoretic text, but there's another version of it represented in the Septuagint that is a longer version. And last year we read that, and perhaps even the year before, if I'm remembering correctly, and we've talked about the different versions in the past. But we hadn't read the account of this same story by Josephus. And so that's what we started to do last night, and we got about halfway through his telling of the story. And so we hope to read through the rest of his telling tonight. And of course, we are discussing it as we go. We'll typically read a paragraph and then kind of discuss that paragraph. We might stop for footnotes or, something along those lines. But that's basically how we've been doing it. If you want to get to this place online, you can go to earlyjewishwritings.com. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, there's a section of the writings of Josephus. And we are in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 11, Chapter 6. So you have to go to Book 11 and then scroll down to Chapter 6. And we are at paragraph 9 in that place. So were there any comments or questions before we get into this?
I have a comment.
Sure.
Well, when we were reading yesterday from Josephus, he said that Haman was an Amalekite. And then you had mentioned that in the book of Esther, it mentions Agagite. I think that's how you say it.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, I found that interesting because I kind of was thinking about the story of the Amalekites, so I looked that up, and in chapter 3 of Esther, it says that Haman was the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. So anyway, then it says refer to 1 Samuel 15:8, and there it says, and this is about the battle with Saul and the Amalekites, but it says, and he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. So I found that interesting, that Agag and Agagites are very similar. So I'm wondering if Josephus was probably right, and he is an Amalekite.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Yeah, I'm glad that you looked at that connection. I had wondered if there's some sort of connection, if they were just two different names for the same people. But yeah, I mean, it sounds, Agagites, it's like, okay, well, who are they? Amalekites is a little bit more well-known. So, yeah, it makes sense that Josephus would use the name Amalekites because, yeah, it looks like that's who they actually were.
Right. But the interesting thing is, if you read chapter 15, the story about Saul and Samuel, Saul was told by God through Samuel in verse 3 of chapter 15, he says, now go and smite Amalek. He was like the king, I guess, at that time, and utterly destroy all that they have and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, and ox and sheep and camel and ass. And Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 footmen and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to a city of Amalek and laid wait in the valley. And Saul said unto the Kenites, go depart, get you down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For ye showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until Shur over against Egypt. And he took Agag the king of the Amalekites alive. But the thing is, Saul says that he utterly destroyed all the Amalekites like God told him to do. But then Samuel went to him later and said, well, why did you disobey God? Because you didn't destroy all of them. He kept the king alive, and he kept all of the cattle and the oxen and the sheep and the goats and all that alive. And, of course, the story goes on, probably you all remember, where Samuel actually slew the king himself. But it makes it sound like there were no more Amalekites. But evidently one got missed somewhere.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah, I'd have to look at that in more detail. But, yeah, this kind of reminds me of kind of the whole Canaanite conquest and certain of the nations who they were supposed to just entirely wipe out. And the Amalekites were among them. And all of those places are basically giant clans. So I'd like to look a little bit more into that. Anyway, yeah, that's. I'm glad that you looked into that though, and are mentioning these different aspects. But yeah, evidently, hey, at least one got through.
Yeah, I think so. And also in Exodus 17, it talks about the battle that Moses and Joshua had with the Amalekites. And it says, after Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword, the Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. For I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi. For he said, because the Lord hath sworn that the Lord will have war with the Amalek from generation to generation. Thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah, the Amalekites, if I'm remembering later too, in Numbers or something, it talks about how even to the 10th generation or something, they cannot join on to Israel. But yeah, certainly what seems like an eternal enmity placed between Israel and the Amalekites. Interesting too how it says, I will wipe out their memory from under heaven, or however it puts it. But then it says, I'll be at war with them from generation to generation. So it's kind of implying that maybe they won't be utterly wiped out, which means that it's kind of like often people read that about the memory of a certain people being wiped out, and then people kind of think, well, how does that work? Because I'm reading about them right now. So obviously, we remember who they are. But I don't think that's what it's talking about. It's, the remembrance of them is kind of like their honor and their glory or something along those lines. But yeah, I mean, going all the way from that point to the days of Esther is a long time. And you still have this guy. And what's amazing is that it's not only that Haman was of that lineage, but that evidently it was known. It's not like it was just lost. Evidently there was a people who retained the knowledge of their ancestry, which would imply that most likely it was at least a slightly larger group. So that's kind of interesting.
Do you know who Amalek was?
I am not remembering.
Well, I was reading online. It's about Josephus' view of the Amalekites. But anyway, this appears to be scholarly. It says that he was the grandson of Esau. He was he was born to Timnah, the concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son. So I think that was kind of interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah, I just looked up the Wikipedia page for Amalek, and that's one of the first things it says, that it may refer to the grandson of Esau. Okay. Oh, yes. So then it says Josephus refers to Amalek as a bastard, though in a derogative sense. Just a comment, too, that I have before getting into this is I have just really enjoyed reading this story from Josephus.
Me too.
Yeah, the added little bits of information here and there are certainly helpful. And it's just another telling of it. Okay, so any other comments or questions before we dive back in? All right, well, if there are no other comments or questions, would someone like to volunteer to start out reading for us?
I'll read the first paragraph.
Sure.
When Esther had used this supplication for 3 days, she put off those garments. Yeah, you want to recap where we're at?
Yeah, I was just thinking we should probably recap. So let's see, what was the last thing?
Basically, the last thing that had happened is Haman had just gotten King Artexerxes to agree to make a decree to kill all the Jews. And it was because, he was upset that Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him and honor him and worship him and all that. So Mordecai has been fasting and praying and mourning, yes, and the rest of the people in the countryside as well, the rest of the Jews. And he got word to Esther about it, and she said that she's going to fast for 3 days along with her attending women. And that's about where we're at.
Yeah, at first she was reluctant to go into the king and kind of, request from him or to somehow talk to him about this whole circumstance and changing it. And at first, she just wasn't really up for that because she knew that, hey, anyone who goes in will be killed. Who appears before the king without being asked will be killed, most likely right on the spot, and they had guards there.
That was one thing we learned that we didn't know before. It's not in the books of Esther that we have.
Not to our memory, anyways.
Yeah, that there's actually guards there with the king in his meeting hall or whatever with big axes ready to kill someone on the spot unless the king holds out his golden scepter and pardons the person who comes in unbeckoned.
Mm-hmm. So at first, when Esther found out that Mordecai was mourning, she had sent a message to him saying, hey, don't mourn like this anymore, because she didn't know what was happening. Then he told her what was happening, requested her to beseech the king on their behalf, and she was reluctant at first, and then now she has just sent the message that she will agree to do it after fasting and praying for 3 days along with her attendants. And then, hey, if it happens for the better, then wonderful. And if she ends up dying as a result, she basically agreed that she'll do that. She'll take the risk.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right, so beginning with paragraph 9. When Esther had used this supplication for 3 days, she put off those garments and changed her habit and adorned herself as became a queen, and took 2 of her handmaids with her, the one of which supported her as she gently leaned upon her, and the other followed after and lifted up her large train, which swept along the ground, with the extremities of her fingers. And thus she came to the king. So the girl is holding it with her fingers.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And thus she came to the king, having a blushing redness in her countenance, with a pleasant agreeableness in her behavior. Yet did she go into him with fear. And as soon as she was come over against him, as he was sitting on his throne in his royal apparel, which was a garment interwoven with gold and precious stones, which made him seem to her more terrible, especially when he looked at her somewhat severely, and with a countenance on fire with anger, her joints failed her immediately out of the dread she was in, and she fell down sideways in a swoon. But the king changed his mind, which happened, as I suppose, by the will of God, and was concerned for his wife, lest her fear should bring some very ill thing upon her.
Very ill thing, yours says?
Yes.
Okay, in my translation, which is supposed to be the same, but there's some differences due to, I guess, copying mistakes or whatever, but mine says evil rather than ill.
So it might read, lest her fear should bring some very evil thing upon her?
Yeah.
Okay. So evil or ill thing upon her. And he leaped from his throne and took her in his arms and recovered her by embracing her and speaking comfortably to her and exhorting her to be of good cheer and not to suspect anything that was sad on account of her coming to him without being called, because that law was made for subjects, but that she, who was a queen as well as he a king, might be entirely secure. And as he said this, he put the scepter into her hand and laid his rod upon her neck on account of the law, and so freed her from her fear. And after she had recovered herself by these encouragements, she said, My Lord, it is not easy for me on the sudden to say what hath happened, for as soon as I saw thee to be great and comely and terrible, my spirit departed from me, and I had no soul left in me. And while it was with difficulty and in a low voice that she could say thus much, the king was in a great agony and disorder, and encouraged Esther to be of good cheer and to expect better fortune, since he was ready, if occasion should require it, to grant her the half of his kingdom. Accordingly, Esther desired that he and his friend Haman would come to her to a banquet, for she said she had prepared a supper for him. He consented to it, and when they were there, as they were drinking, he bid Esther to let him know what she desired, for that she should not be disappointed, though she should desire the half of his kingdom. But she put off the discovery of her petition till the next day, if he would come again, together with Haman, to her banquet.
Okay. Any comments or questions?
Everyone got quiet tonight. Man. So far this is pretty along the same lines of the other texts that we have, so far as I can tell.
Yeah, there's a few extra little details, I think, like of kind of what the king was thinking, so to speak, when he kind of jumped off his throne and went to her. But as far as even putting the rod in her hands or the scepter in his hand and all that, I think is recorded in the other records.
I thought it interesting that we find out from this that he says that law was only for the subjects rather than for the king and queen. And, of course, she obviously didn't know it, and she was the queen. So somebody didn't tell her chain of command here.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of an important thing. Yeah, I don't remember that part actually either.
I don't either.
Yeah. So that's quite interesting.
It seems like he would just use it however he wanted to.
Maybe.
I mean, if he wanted to apply that to her, I would imagine he would.
Yeah, he might have the right to interpret the laws.
Yeah, he might have just told her that to set her mind at ease, like, hey, it's okay, don't worry about it. Mm-hmm. But that certainly isn't mentioned that I recall in the other books. That's true.
So if there are other comments, please do feel free to voice them. And otherwise, would someone else like to volunteer to read paragraph 10?
I will.
Great. Okay.
Paragraph 10. Now when the king had promised so to do, Haman went away very glad, because he alone had the honor of supping with the king at Esther's banquet, and because no one else partook of the same honor with kings but himself. Yet when he saw Mordecai in the court, he was very much displeased, for he paid him no manner of respect when he saw him. So he went home and called for his wife Zeresh and his friend, and when they were come, he showed them what honor he enjoyed, not only from the king, but from the queen also. For as he alone had that day supped with her, together with the king, so was he also invited again for the next day. Yet, said he, am I not pleased to see Mordecai the Jew in the court? Hereupon his wife Zeresh advised him to give order that a gallows should be made 50 cubits high, and that in the morning he should ask it of the king that Mordecai might be hanged thereon. So he commanded her advice and gave order to his servants to prepare the gallows and to place it in the court for the punishment of Mordecai thereon, which was accordingly prepared. But God laughed to scorn the wicked expectations of Haman, and as he knew what the event would be, he was delighted at it. For that night he took away the king's sleep, and as the king was not willing to lose the time of his lying awake, but to spend it in something that might be of advantage to his kingdom, he commanded the scribe to bring him the chronicles of the former kings and the records of his own actions. And when he had brought them and was reading them, one was found to have received a country on account of his excellent management on a certain occasion, and the name of the country was set down. Another was found to have had a present made him on account of his fidelity. Then the scribe came to Bigthan and Teresh, the eunuchs that had made a conspiracy against the king, which Mordecai had discovered. And when the scribe said no more but that, and was going on to another history, the king stopped him and inquired whether it was not added that Mordecai had a reward given him. And when he said there was no such addition, he bade him leave off, and he inquired of those that were appointed for that purpose what hour of the night it was. And when he was informed that it was already day, he gave order that if they found any one of his friends already come and standing before the court, they should tell him. Now it happened that Haman was found there, for he was come sooner than ordinary to petition the king to have Mordecai put to death. And when the servant said that Haman was before the court, he bid them call him in. And when he was come in, he said, Because I know that thou art my only fast friend, I desire thee to give me advice how I may honor one that I greatly love, and that after a manner suitable to my magnificence. Now Haman reasoned with himself that what opinion he should give it would be for himself, since it was he alone who was beloved by the king. So he gave that advice which he thought of all other the best. For he said, If thou wouldst truly honor a man whom thou sayest thou dost love, give order that he may ride on horseback with the same garment on which thou wearest, and with a gold chain about his neck. And let one of thy intimate friends go before him, and proclaim through the whole city that whosoever the king honoreth obtaineth this mark of his honor. This was the advice which Haman gave, out of a supposal that such a reward would come to himself. Hereupon the king was pleased with the advice, and said, Go thou therefore, for thou hast the horse, the garment, and the chain. Ask for Mordecai the Jew, and give him those things, and go before his horse, and proclaim accordingly. For thou art, said he, my intimate friend, and hast given me good advice. Be thou then the minister of what thou hast advised me to do. This shall be his reward from us for preserving my life. When he heard this order, which was entirely unexpected, he was confounded in his mind, and knew not what to do. However, he went out and led the horse, and took the purple garment and the golden chain for the neck, and finding Mordecai before the court, clothed in sackcloth, he bid him put the garment off, and put the purple garment on. But Mordecai, not knowing the truth of the matter, but thinking that it was done in mockery, said, O thou wretch, the vilest of all mankind, dost thou thus laugh at our calamities? But when he was satisfied that the king bestowed this honor upon him for the deliverance he had procured him when he convicted the eunuchs who had conspired against him, he put on that purple garment which the king always wore, and put the chain about his neck, and got on horseback, and went round the city, while Haman went before him and proclaimed, This shall be the reward which the king will bestow on every one whom he loves and esteems worthy of honor. And when they had gone round the city, Mordecai went into the king, but Haman went home out of shame, and informed his wife and friends of what had happened, and this with tears. who said that he would never be able to be revenged of Mordecai, for that God was with him.
Very, very interesting.
Oh, there's some very interesting things in there for sure.
So strange that you can have these people on death row, and still the king is honoring one of them. You know, the Jews are just, there's a day appointed, they're all going to die, and it just seems like that doesn't even factor in, and Artaxerxes is just honoring Mordecai regardless of that fact. Interesting here, too, how Mordecai was reluctant to put on the purple.
Yeah, we don't
garment.
have that in the other records.
Yeah.
But something I wanted to mention, I don't know if anyone else caught this, but according to this record, when the king was hearing the chronicles being read to him and learned that Mordecai hadn't been rewarded, he asked someone there to go out and look for whatever friend of his was closest. And it just so happened to be Haman. So when Haman comes in, the king tells him, I'm asking you this because you're my dearest friend.
Right.
But he would have said that, it sounds like, he would have said that to anybody that had been there of, quote, one of his friends.
That's a good point. Yeah, because he wasn't saying, go find Haman. I want to ask him because he's my best friend. He's saying, go find any of my friends, whichever one's the closest, and it just happened to be Haman.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It gives you a little bit more insight, you know, along with kind of the extra bit of information we had at the beginning in regard to Vashti, his wife and all. Gives you a little bit more insight into his character or personality, that sort of thing.
Well, I think it's interesting, you know, that when he started looking at these records, it says that he noticed that, you know, one person did something for a king and was rewarded by receiving a country, and then another person was rewarded with another present, and then here's a guy that helped him, you know, in a very amazing way, you know, saved his life, and he hadn't done anything. So it's kind of like, it's almost like a pride thing to me, you know, like, well, this is what's done, you know, this is the thing to do, and so I need to do it like everybody else did, and I just see this oversight.
Yeah, I think it's totally part of the honor-shame society that they were in. That, hey, you know, in order to be the most honorable, you have to bestow honors on someone who did something right. And if you don't, then you're basically shaming yourself. So, yeah, I can definitely see that. Any other comments? All right. If someone else would like to read the next paragraph, that's fine. If not, if you would like to read it, Carol, that's fine too.
Okay, I'll be glad to. Paragraph 11. Now, while these men were thus talking one to another, Esther's eunuchs hastened Haman away to come to supper. But one of the eunuchs, named Sabechatus, saw the gallows that was fixed in Haman's house, and inquired of one of his servants for what purpose they had prepared it. So he knew that it was for the queen's uncle, because Haman was about to petition the king that he might be punished, but at present he held his peace. Now when the king with Haman were at the banquet, he desired the queen to tell him what gifts she desired to obtain, and assured her that she should have whatsoever she had a mind to. She then lamented the danger her people were in, and said that, she and her nations were given up to be destroyed, and that she, on that account, made this her petition, that she would not have troubled him if he had only given order that they should be sold into bitter servitude, for such a misfortune would not have been intolerable, but she desired that they might be delivered from such destruction. And when the king inquired of her whom was the author of this misery to them, she then openly accused Haman and convicted him that he had been the wicked instrument of this, and had formed this plot against them. When the king was hereupon in disorder, and was gone hastily out of the banquet into the garden, Haman began to intercede with Esther, and to beseech her to forgive him as to what he had offended, for he perceived that he was in a very bad case. And as he had fallen upon the queen's bed and was making supplication to her, the king came in, and being still more provoked at what he saw, "O thou wretch," said he, "thou vilest of mankind, dost thou aim to force in wife?" And when Haman was astonished at this, and not able to speak one word more, Sabbacatus the eunuch came in and accused Haman and said, "He found a gallows at his house, prepared for Mordecai, for that the servant told him so much upon his inquiry when he was sent to him to call him to supper. He said further that the gallows was 50 cubits high, which, when the king heard, he determined that Haman should be punished after no other manner than that which had been devised by him against Mordecai. So he gave order immediately that he should be hung upon those gallows, and be put to death after that manner. And from hence I cannot forbear to admire God, and to learn hence his wisdom and his justice, not only in punishing the wickedness of Haman, but in so disposing it that he should undergo the very same punishment which he had contrived for another, as also because thereby he teaches others this lesson, that what mischief anyone prepares against another, he, without knowing of it, first contrives it against himself."
He that digs the pit falls in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some extra stuff here too.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone else remember? I thought that they had dinner 3 times. This was just twice. Does anyone know what the other books say?
I always thought it was just twice.
Okay.
But I could be wrong.
And I can't remember clearly one way or the other. Any other comments on this?
Well, there was something that I think I don't remember being in the other books either, and that is that when the eunuchs went to get Haman to come back for the second supper, that one of the eunuchs saw the gallows and asked another of the servants there at Haman's house what it was all about, and that's why he knew who the gallows were for. I remember it being said in the long version of Esther at the very least, and possibly in the short version of Esther as well, that when it was made known at the supper that Haman was responsible and the king was all upset, that the eunuch stepped up and said, "Hey, by the way, he's got gallows built for Mordecai." And so that was why the king said, "Well, let him be hanged on it."
Yeah, another aspect here is 50 cubits high. That's really high for a gallows. I just looked at the footnote of Esther 5:14, or one of the footnotes in the NET, and the way it does it is it translates it as 75 feet. And then they get the footnote giving the literal reading 50 cubits, and how kind of the standard idea for how large a cubit is 18 inches, and so with that it would be about 75 feet. And then of course they explain how that's extremely high, and that maybe there was a larger structure there, and then it was built on top of the structure. And so the distance from there to the ground was 75 feet, but maybe not the structure of the gallows itself. But that's really kind of overkill. It showed how he wanted it to be a very public thing.
Mm-hmm.
He was into public humiliation and public honor. So yeah, that's another aspect to this.
Well, in my looking to try to find the answer to my question, I noticed there was something I came across. It's just a little bit out of order with what we're reading in Josephus. According to the short book of Esther, Esther had gone to the king, unless I'm getting things mixed up already. Esther had gone to the king and asked for he and Haman to come to supper. So she did the whole going unrequested and unannounced and all that before the king. And it was after that the king was up listening to the Chronicles being read. Was that what we just read in Josephus too?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. I'm glad my memory is working so well.
Were there any other comments on this paragraph?
I have, I'm looking at, I read earlier, I'm reading something from Josephus, but it's got little commentaries on it. And about the banquets, it says, Josephus telescopes the two banquets that occurred in the Bible, again, apparently to suit his Greek readers. This increases the pace of the story and eliminates the fairy tale aspect of the repeated requests. In addition, it has the effect of making Esther more assertive and less hesitant than the biblical story.
So is that saying that in the biblical story there are three sufferers?
Yeah, I think that, yeah. And he just combines the two into one to speed it up.
Right.
Okay.
The comments that it made in this reading of it were interesting, because it was kind of just telling about how Josephus sort of wrote this and maybe changed some things because of his audience, because maybe he didn't want to offend emperors and other nationalities. So he kind of, it sounds like he kind of, changed the story a little bit to fit his audience, and even to make it seem more exciting, or to eliminate certain things and make it go faster and that kind of thing. In the commentary, that was just a general theme that was going on there.
Interesting.
I'd like to make a comment.
Sure.
Yeah, when you're done with that.
I was just going to say it doesn't seem unlikely. Yeah.
I was thinking that, she had a banquet and she brought them in and she discusses just a little bit, but then she puts it off and she says, okay, tomorrow night, come again. And I was thinking, now why in the world would she do that? And I'm thinking that, she had been fasting for 3 days, and she was really in connection with the God of heaven. And, sometimes God only gives us one step at a time, and we're to be obedient to that one step before we're given another step. And so I was thinking, well, maybe that's what was happening, is that she didn't really know everything that she was going to say or do yet. And so she said, okay, come back again tomorrow night. And then that's when God gave her the rest of the information of what to say and do. And in the meantime, God was telling the king, go read these books. And so it all kind of came together. And so I was just thinking that maybe that's why it took a couple of days for everything to play out.
Yeah,
sounds reasonable for sure. That's certainly not out of the order of our Heavenly Family's workings.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments? All right, shall we move on to the next paragraph then?
Paragraph 12. Wherefore Haman, who had immoderately abused the honor he had from the king, was destroyed after this manner, and the king granted his estate to the queen. He also called for Mordecai, for Esther had informed him that she was akin to him, and gave that ring to Mordecai which he had before given to Haman. The queen also gave Haman's estate to Mordecai, and prayed the king to deliver the nation of the Jews from the fear of death, and showed him what had been written over all the country by Haman the son of Ammedatha, for that if her country were destroyed, and her countrymen were to perish, she could not bear to live herself any longer. So the king promised her that he would not do anything that should be disagreeable to her, nor contradict what she desired, but he bid her write what she pleased about the Jews in the king's name, and seal it with his seal, and send it to all his kingdom, for that those who read epistles whose authority is secured by having the king's seal to them would no way contradict what was written therein. So he commanded the king's scribes to be sent for, and to write to the nations on the Jews' behalf, and to his lieutenants and governors that were over his 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Now the contents of this epistle were these: The great King Artexerxes to our rulers, and those that are our faithful subjects, send us greeting. There's a footnote there. Shall we take a look at it?
Sure, yeah, let's do that. Okay, so it says here, the true reason why King Artaxerxes did not here properly revoke his former barbarous decree for the universal slaughter of the Jews, but only empowered and encouraged the Jews to fight for their lives and to kill their enemies if they attempted their destruction, seems to have been that old law of the Medes and Persians, not yet laid aside, that whatever decree was signed both by the king and his lords could not be changed, but remained unalterable. Daniel 6, verses 7 to 9, also verses 12, 15, and 17. Also Esther chapter 1, verse 19, and Esther chapter 8, verse 8. And Haman, having engrossed the royal favor, might perhaps have himself signed this decree for the Jews' slaughter instead of the ancient lords, and so might have rendered it by their rules irrevocable.
I thought it interesting that this telling didn't go into any of that.
Yeah, I didn't mention it.
It had to be put in as a footnote. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, continuing on with the edict. It says, Many men there are who, on account of the greatness of the benefits bestowed on them, and because of the honor which they have obtained from the wonderful kind treatment of those that bestowed it, are not only injurious to their inferiors, but do not scruple to do evil to those that have been their benefactors, as if they would take away gratitude from among men, and by their insolent abuse of such benefits as they never expected, they turn the abundance they have against those that are the authors of it, and suppose they shall lie concealed from God in that case, and avoid that vengeance that comes from him. Some of these men, when they have had the management of affairs committed to them by their friends, and bearing private malice of their own against some others, by deceiving those that have the power, persuade them to be angry at such as have done them no harm, till they are in danger of perishing, and this by laying accusations and calumnies. Nor is this state of things to be discovered by ancient examples, or such as we have learned by report only, but by some examples of such impudent attempts under our own eyes, so that it is not fit to attend any longer to calumnies and accusations, nor to the persuasions of others, but to determine what anyone knows of himself to have been really done, and to punish what justly deserves it, and to grant favors to such as are innocent. This hath been the case of Haman, the son of Ammedatha, by birth an Amalekite, an alien from the blood of the Persians, who, when he was hospitably entertained by us, and partook of that kindness which we bear to all men to so great a degree as to be called my father, and to be all along worshipped, and to have honor paid him by all in the second rank after the royal honor due to ourselves, he could not bear his good fortune, nor govern the magnitude of his prosperity with sound reason. Nay, he made a conspiracy against me and my life, who gave him his authority by endeavoring to take away Mordecai, my benefactor and my Savior, and by basely and treacherously requiring to have Esther, the partner of my life and of my dominion, brought to destruction. For he contrived by this means to deprive me of my faithful friends and transfer the government to others. Shall we look at that footnote?
Sure, yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
Okay.
Okay, it says, these words give an intimation as if Artaxerxes suspected a deeper design in Haman than openly appeared, viz., that knowing the Jews would be faithful to him, and that he could never transfer the crown to his own family, who was an Agagite, Esther 3:1 and 10, or of the posterity of Agag, the old king of the Amalekites, 1 Samuel 15:8 and verses 32 to 33, while they were alive, and spread over all his dominions. He therefore endeavored to destroy them. Nor is it to me improbable that those 75,800 of the Jews' enemies, which were soon destroyed by the Jews on the permission of the king, which must be on some great occasion, were Amalekites, their old and hereditary enemies, Exodus 17, verses 14 to 15, and that thereby was fulfilled Balaam's prophecy. Amalek was the first of the nations, but his latter end shall be that he perish forever. Numbers 24, verse 20.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, certainly.
Although, well, there's a couple things interesting. This footnote is saying that it's giving credit to Artaxerxes for the phrasing of the letter. But both here in Josephus and in the book of Esther, it's Esther that writes it.
Yeah.
Or that dictates it to the scribe, at least.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone suspected it, it was her, is what it appears.
Certainly, yeah, that is very interesting.
All right, shall I read on in the edict?
Sure.
Okay. It says, but since I perceived that these Jews that were by this pernicious fellow devoted to destruction were not wicked men, but conducted their lives after the best manner, and were men dedicated to the worship of that God who hath preserved the kingdom to me and to my ancestors, I do not only free them from the punishment which the former epistle which was sent by Haman ordered to be inflicted on them, to which, if you refuse obedience, you shall do well, but I will that they have all honor paid to them. Accordingly, I have hanged up the man that contrived such things against them with his family before the gates of Shushan, that punishment being sent upon him by God who seeth all things. And I give you in charge that you publicly propose a copy of this epistle through all my kingdom, that the Jews may be permitted peaceably to use their own laws, and that you assist them, that at the same season whereto their miserable estate did belong, that they may defend themselves the very same day from unjust violence, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar, For God hath made that day a day of salvation instead of a day of destruction to them. And may it be a good day to those that wish us well, and a memorial of the punishment of the conspirators against it. And I will that you take notice that every city and every nation that shall disobey anything that is contained in this epistle shall be destroyed by fire and sword. However, let this epistle be published through all the country that is under our obedience, and let all the Jews by all means be ready against the day before mentioned, that they may avenge themselves upon their enemies. I think it's interesting it says avenge themselves upon their enemies rather than defend themselves against their enemies.
Very interesting, yeah. Also interesting is the fact that here it says the 13th day of the 12th month.
It mentions that in the long book of Esther too, right?
And in the short book, there's an issue with the 13th day and the 14th day and the 15th day. And basically the way it is the 13th day, according to one of the letters, was supposed to be the day on which it was, they were to be slain. But then elsewhere in the books of Esther, both the short version and the long version, it applies that to be in the 14th day. And here, within Josephus, earlier when it mentioned what was to take place, and the decree actually went out and it gave the record of the decree, it said the 14th day. So you have that same discrepancy in the books of Esther and here. And then when it actually happened, basically it took a couple of days, and those who were in the cities defended themselves on the 14th day, and those in the countryside, since it took longer to get the news to them, they were still having to defend themselves, and they finally had their deliverance on the 15th day. And so in the book of Esther, the only 2 days in both the short version and the long version that are actually called a memorial that is supposed to be kept year after year were the 14th day and the 15th day. But here, even though this isn't after the fact, this is still before, it refers to the 13th day as a memorial.
Where does it say that for the 13th day?
Let's see.
Because in the next paragraph, it's talking about a festival on the 14th and the 15th.
Right, that's what we normally read. But in what we just read, it says, they may defend themselves the very same day from unjust violence, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar, for God hath made that day a day of salvation, instead of a day of destruction to them, and may it be a good day to those that wish us well, and a memorial of the punishment of the conspirators against us. So in this version, it actually calls that day a memorial.
Right.
Which is quite interesting.
Well, there was another thing that I found interesting about this edict, and that is she actually, according to this, writes it in such a way that the king is revoking the order to destroy the Jews and saying, you guys would do well to not do that. But if you do, you'll be wiped out, basically. I lost it where it says that.
It says, let's see, the former epistle which was sent by Haman in order to be inflicted on them, to which if you refuse obedience, you shall do well.
Right.
So you're talking about?
Right.
Yep.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it was legally revoked, but it just does mean that it will no longer be enforced, that they must do it, and that it's better if they don't. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. Another thing, actually, in connection with what you had said earlier when we read the footnote about it actually being Esther, not Haman. I was thinking, though, how Esther may have been writing this to represent as best as possible the actual perspective and thoughts of, Esther instead of Artaxerxes, not Haman, but she may have been writing it to capture the attitude and thoughts of Artaxerxes rather than her own thoughts. And in talking to him on the subject, it may have been that he actually kind of had thought further through the subject, and that his actual thoughts are reflected here. So that was just kind of a side note, but I was thinking of that. Any other comments?
I have one. Trent, is
Sure.
there an antitype to this for our day sometime?
Yeah, that's something that both Ellen White and Victor Hoddeth speak of briefly, and I have no further light on the subject than what they gave. So there's a couple places that you could look up, particularly with Ellen White, I think, where she makes a couple statements, and maybe even in the studies that we had last year, someone read one of the statements, perhaps. I haven't listened to it, so it's been a year. But then there's another statement that Victor Hoddeth makes. It could be in either Tract 12, and it might be an older version or older edition of Tract 12, or it might be in one of the letter-sized timely greetings. I'm not sure exactly where it is. I'd have to look for it.
Well, there's 8 or 9 places in the Shepherd's Rod CD-ROM where the name Esther is mentioned, and a couple of them are not talking about the book of Esther, but Esther and Ruth. But it looks like in track number 13 it's mentioned, and 2 timely greetings, 45 and 46.
Yeah, those ones so far I don't think are the ones.
And then 3 symbolic code, 5 and 6.
Yeah, I don't think those are the ones. I don't think it's in the regular editions of Hoddeth's writings. I think it's most likely in the letter-sized timely greetings.
Okay.
Or he makes an adjectival application. I believe he connects it to either the dragon or the leopard-like beast, which is what Ellen White makes similar applications.
Thank you. I'll check the website to see if there's something.
All right, and it most likely won't be on the website. Although, hey, maybe the Old Branch website, maybe Ben or Lois said something in regard to it. I'm not remembering myself if they did or didn't. But they, from everything that I've read from past messengers, they've only made the most general statements in relation to it. No detailed view of the subject. Any other comments? We only have one more paragraph, so perhaps we should go into that.
Okay, paragraph 13. Accordingly, the horsemen who carried the epistles proceeded on the ways which they were to go with speed. But as for Mordecai, as soon as he had assumed the royal garment and the crown of gold and had put the chain about his neck, he went forth in a public procession. And when the Jews who were at Shushan saw him in so great honor with the king, they thought his good fortune was common to themselves also, and joy and a beam of salvation encompassed the Jews, both those that were in the cities and those that were in the countries upon the publication of the king's letters, insomuch that many even of other nations circumcised their foreskin for fear of the Jews, that they might procure safety to themselves thereby. For on the 13th day of the 12th month, which according to the Hebrews is called Adar, but according to the Macedonians, Dystrus, those that carried the king's epistle gave them notice that the same day wherein their danger was to have been, on that very same day they should destroy their enemies. But now the rulers of the provinces, and the tyrants, and the kings, and the scribes had the Jews in esteem, for the fear they were in of Mordecai forced them to act with discretion. Now when the royal decree was come to all the country that was subject to the king, it fell out that the Jews at Shushan slew 500 of their enemies. And when the king had told Esther the number of those that were slain in that city, but did not well know what had been done in the provinces, he asked her whether she would have anything further done against them, for that it should be done accordingly, upon which she desired that the Jews might be permitted to treat their remaining enemies in the same manner the next day, as also that they might hang the 10 sons of Haman upon the gallows. So the king permitted the Jews so to do, as desirous not to contradict Esther. So they gathered themselves together again on the 14th day of the month Dystrus, and slew about 300 of their enemies, but touched nothing of what riches they had. Now there were slain by the Jews that were in the country and in the other cities 75,000 of their enemies, and these were slain on the 13th day of the month. And the next day they kept as a festival. In like manner the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together and feasted on the 14th day, and that which followed it, whence it is that even now all the Jews that are in the habitable earth keep these days festival, and send portions to one another. Mordecai also wrote to the Jews that lived in the kingdom of Artexerxes to observe these days, and celebrate them as festivals, and to deliver them down to posterity, that this festival might continue for all time to come, and that it might never be buried in oblivion. For since they were about to be destroyed on these days by Haman, they would do a right thing upon escaping the danger in them, and on them inflicting punishment on their enemies, to observe those days and give thanks to God on them, for which cause the Jews still keep the aforementioned days, and call them days of Purim. And Mordecai became a great and illustrious person with the king, and assisted him in the government of the people. He also lived with the queen, so that the affairs of the Jews were, by their means, better than they could ever have hoped for. And this was the state of the Jews under the reign of Artaxerxes. And there's a footnote there.
Yeah, and at least in my version, I'm not sure about the version that you guys are looking at. There was actually 2 footnotes there.
Just one here.
Okay, see, mine has one at the name Purim or Purim.
That's where ours is.
And then it has another one at the end of the paragraph. So I'll read both of those. So the one that says Purim and then square brackets or Purim. Take here part of Relland's note on this disputed passage. Quote, in Josephus' copies, these Hebrew words, days of Purim or lots, as in the Greek copies of Esther, chapter 9, verse 26 and verse 28-32, is read days of Purim or days of protection, but ought to read days of Purim, as in the Hebrew, than which amendation, says he, nothing is more certain. And had we any assurance that Josephus' copy mentioned the casting of lots, as our other copies do, Esther 3:7, I should fully agree with Relland. But as it now stands, it seems to me by no means certain. Okay, so that's interesting that either days of
Is that where yours
lots.
ends?
Yeah,
I have a lot more in my footnote. Maybe they split up the two.
Maybe. Does it say as to?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
That's it. Okay.
So that's interesting. So those two footnotes were put together. So that one, first we'll just comment on that, and I had never heard that before about Purim being protection and Purim being lots. So he's saying, from what I understand anyways from the footnote, he's saying that he isn't certain that in Josephus's version of Esther that he had, that it did mention anything about lots. That it may have just simply been days of Purim or days of protection.
Mhm.
Which certainly would make sense. Reminds me of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks or Feast of Sevens. Shavuot, if you don't have pointed Hebrew, with the vowel pointing, it is also the word for oaths. So it's the Feast of Oaths. So that's kind of interesting. And books like the Book of Jubilees make that point and speak of it as though it's the Feast of Oaths. So anyways, the last comment here, which is just the rest of the comment that you guys have, it says, as to this whole book of Esther in the present Hebrew copy, it is so very imperfect, in a case where the providence of God was so very remarkable. And the Septuagint and Josephus have so much of religion that it has not so much as the name of God once in it. And it's hard to say who made that epitome which the Masoretes have given us for the genuine book itself. No religious Jews could well be the authors of it, whose education obliged them to have a constant regard to God, and whatsoever related to his worship. Nor do we know that there ever was so imperfect a copy of it in the world till after the days of Bar Kokhba in the 2nd century. So that's interesting. Clearly the person here is saying, hey, look, that version is clearly corrupted, and there's no way it could have come about by religious Jews. And seriously, look at the book of Esther. In the Protestant Bibles, going according to the Hebrew Bible, as represented in the Masoretic text, it doesn't really even mention God. The name of God isn't even occurring in it one time. There's very little in it. In fact, there's nothing in it that would really even suggest that it's a religious book or was written by religious devotees. So the point here is quite interesting, and I find it interesting too that he's saying that we don't have evidence for anything like that version of the book until after the days of Bar Kokhba, which was in the first quarter of the 2nd century A.D. So in the 2nd century A.D. Would possibly be when that version of the book came about, according to the person who wrote this note. So it is kind of interesting how both in Josephus' account and also in the Septuagint, the story is presented in a far more religious manner. Any other comments?
I had, there was an interesting concluding comment on the version I was reading on Josephus. I'll just read the first paragraph, it's short. It just says, the story begins with Queen Ashti refusing to obey the drunken king, who in great umbrage decides he must set an example for all the males of his kingdom and show them that they are to each be the king of their castle. But I suggest both the king and Esther learn from that episode, for the king finds he acted rashly in Mrs. Ashti, and so he learned to rein in his temper when Esther disobeys and comes into him unsummoned. And Esther learns the king must be treated gently and with subtlety if a queen is to obtain what she desires.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What version are you reading from?
I'm just on Josephus.org. It's the Josephus version of Esther. It's called Esther: Her Point of View, Josephus's version with commentary.
Okay, so Josephus.org. I'm glad that you mentioned that. Yeah, I was just curious because I think, hey, having different translations of these works is very important. So I'll have to check this web page out, and I don't think we have it on the resources page of the website, but perhaps it's one that should be added.
Yeah, I just Googled it. It's just it's kind of like it's just got like Cliff Notes comments on it, and they're interesting. Who knows if they're anything, but they're definitely interesting.
Right. Sure. Okay. Well, that's good. So are there any other comments on that last paragraph or on this subject as a whole? There are a couple aspects that come to my mind. It's mentioned here, although it's not emphasized, but in the book, the versions of the book of Esther itself, it talks about sending gifts one to another during Purim.
Right.
And it's mentioned here briefly, so I wanted to ask you guys what your thoughts are on that.
It sounds like Christmas and that part in Revelation when the two witnesses are dead or whatever. Everyone's exchanging gifts.
Okay,
I was going to say it sounds a little like self is involved and like it's a little bit of a blending possibly.
But what would you say if I said, but it's in the Bible?
I say they'd send me a gift.
Okay. That was pretty good. Any other thoughts? I mean, that would be the thought. I mean, I think that the first two comments, Mary's comment and Carol's comment, mentioning, okay, well, that kind of reminds me of Christmas and, Revelation 11, sending gifts to one another, and Carol mentioning selfishness. And so it's like, okay, well, those comments sound as though they are in disagreement with the idea as being a good idea, when, of course, most likely whoever wrote Esther and the Jews who were actually involved in the circumstances at the time would probably think that it's a good idea. So, in other words, the way that it's presented in the Bible doesn't necessarily come across as negative. And Esther, again, whoever wrote it probably isn't thinking of it as a negative thing. So if someone was to bring those things up to say, hey, look, this is something we should do, the question is it something that we should do? And are those good reasons for doing it? So I'm asking that question to you guys.
I'm just wondering if maybe they were affected by the whatever Macedonian or whatever Persian culture that they were in at the time. It sounds like it's a fairly I'm just it's just kind of like maybe a pagan thing to do, and they were just copying what they saw their contemporaries doing. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, what about the wise men when they brought their gifts?
That's a good point. What's the difference between the occasion of the wise men bringing the gifts when they did and this gift giving? What's the difference between those two?
I would say that one is clearly giving gifts to our Heavenly Family with no alternative motives, and perhaps giving gifts to each other may not have clear intentions.
Okay, that's a valid observation.
Yeah, certainly.
I'll offer another one. Unless, does anyone else want to offer input on that question as to what the difference is between those two occasions? Okay. So how about this? In the occasion with the wise men, how many times did they bring gifts?
Once.
Okay. And in the occasion of this account of Purim, what's the situation? How many times are people giving these food gifts?
Every year.
Every year. Okay. So with this occasion in Purim, what we see is a recurring annual time set for gift giving. But in the occasion of the wise men, there was the birth of someone, and yes, it did happen to be a member of the Heavenly Family, but even putting aside who it was, just looking at how it was done, it was a gift that they all brought one time for the occasion of the birth. But it wasn't done again, ever, for that same person on the annual occurrence of their birthday. So, we have the example of being able to rightly give a gift to someone just out of the love of our own heart, even if that is at the occasion of a birth, but to give time gifts, to give a gift simply because it's said that at this time, recurringly, whether it's monthly or annually or whatever, then this is the set time to give gifts. That isn't a gift from the heart. It is a gift because it's the time to give.
Right.
Now, it can be a gift from the heart. You know what I mean?
Sure. And the kings who came from the east and everything too, I mean, it's not like it was expected of them to bring gifts. They just brought them, and they weren't even, it's not like they were required by any custom or anything to even travel there and go. Mm-hmm. They just went simply out of the desire to see the Messiah.
That is such a good point, though. I'm glad that you brought that up, because people might be wondering about that.
Right. Yeah, so interesting circumstances. The whole thing with the gifts here, and in Josephus, it's less clear that it was a recurring annual thing as compared to the book, or I almost want to call it the books of Esther, because the versions are quite different. But, so it kind of promotes the idea of giving annual gifts at that time, just giving gifts to each other. So I was thinking back to a place where Victor Hodoff talked about this idea in Tract 13, Christ's Greetings to You. He talks about Christmas and other holidays and giving gifts. So I think, let's see, starting on page 8, he says, exchanging Christmas gifts, however, is not the only evil-breeding custom. Another, no less evil, is the custom of exchanging anniversary gifts. Though birthday gifts in honor of a newly born are in accord with the most generous and noble impulses of mankind, the practice of giving gifts to one another on birth anniversaries is like the kindred practice of exchanging Yuletide gifts, a convention which engenders pride, extravagance, hardship, dissatisfaction, jealousy, sorrow, and a host of related evils. Being obligatory, birthday gifts, just as with Christmas gifts, are in the last analysis not gifts at all, but merely formal exchanges, which in most cases are useless, extravagant, and harmful. The follower of Christ who wholeheartedly cherishes his counsels will eschew this baleful custom and habit, whether the occasion be Christmas, Easter, birthdays, or whatever. He will, in short, shun bestowing any but love gifts. If you wish to give a love gift, not a time gift, let it be something useful, never a luxury or a vanity, and not beyond your means. Let it be prompted by an unselfish and generous spirit rather than by compulsion or pride, custom, or recompense. Let it, in fine, be a genuine love gift in honor of the receiver, not in honor of a time which not only suggests a recompense, but even demands it. So not only suggests a recompense, but even demands it. Christians should be givers, not traders. So then he goes on and talks about Mary with the alabaster box and so on. But those principles of genuine gifts and time gifts and kind of that whole anniversary gift idea is certainly true principle. I mean, there's nothing that can be said to say, oh, well, he missed the principle there. And so comparing that, this is some counsel given through an inspired messenger. And then we see the book of Esther, and it records a habit that people did and that we're still doing at the time Esther was written. We don't know who wrote Esther. Does anyone here know either who wrote Esther or know of any claim to inspiration that Esther makes?
I don't know who wrote it or have any claim to inspiration by the book of Esther.
I would agree with that for myself as well. Anyone else? We'll take that as a no. Okay. So, taking those things into account, it's like, okay, well, if I'm to judge everything on its own merits and not to just favor Esther because it happened to be included just barely, mind you, in the Bible. Esther was one of the most disputed books. One of the reasons why is probably because it is so secular. It doesn't say that. It's basically a historical account. Doesn't claim inspiration.
There's not a lot of mention of God in some of the versions.
Yeah.
Well, there's no mention of God in some of the versions.
Yeah, in the Masoretic version, there's basically no mention of God. In the other versions, yes, God is certainly mentioned more. But it's not really like some people didn't view it as a necessary part of the tale to tell. So Esther and Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, those books were debated for a long time, and some of them were barely included, like Esther. It was just barely included.
And so far to date, there are no copies that have yet been found in any of the Dead Sea Scroll finds.
Right. So it could be that the Dead Sea Scroll community didn't keep the Book of Esther around. It could be also that they did, and it just wasn't preserved over those couple thousand years. It's hard to say. But the point is that if it wasn't included in the Bible, which again, it barely was, if it happened not to be, then people wouldn't give any preference to it. And there would really be no one who would say, oh, well, Victor Houteff, he's speaking against time gifts, but the Bible promotes it, therefore God promotes it. Well, no, the book of Esther seems to speak in favor of the idea, or at least seems to be written in a way that assumes that the practice is at least okay. But again, if we're going to judge it on its own merits, it's like, okay, we have counsel through an inspired messenger on one hand, and we have a book that records history, which is, albeit good history, important history. I mean, I think that it's really good to study this and to go back and learn it. And I mean, hey, all of this is part of the history of God's people. So it is important. But it's one of those things that we have to learn to view according to principle rather than man-made traditions. Any thoughts on any of that? Okay. I would be interested, of course, to hear what everyone else has to say, but if no one else has anything to say, that's fine. And if that's the case, would someone like to volunteer to close off with prayer?
I will.
Okay.
Dear Heavenly Family, we just thank you so much for these days of Purim and all that we've learned about this very interesting and important time in our history, and all that we're learning about you, Heavenly Family. We thank you that you're teaching us how to study and how to think and how to evaluate everything that we come in contact with on the basis of principles. And we thank you for this time that we could socialize together. And we just ask you to continue to bless us all. We thank you, and we ask all these things in the name of Branch, he and she.
Amen.
Amen.